All right, well, we're here with David Anderson on his last week of Microsoft. David, we saw you about a year ago. Robert Scoble interviewed you.
That's right. Yeah.
Yep, Robert's left, and now you're taking off. Where are you headed to?
So I'm going to Corbis. It's a company in downtown Seattle. We do stock photography and image licensing, mostly for professional businesses and publishers. They subscribe to Corbis's service and they use stock photography, for book covers, magazine articles, whatever it might be, commercial brochures and so on. And so it's a pretty significant business, and it happens to be owned by our great leader, Mr. Bill Gates. So it's an interesting opportunity to go down a smaller company, more dynamic, faster moving, interesting growth market.
That's great. Do you know what kind of hands-on level Bill has with Corbis day to day? Is he actively managing it?
He's involved. I don't know how much I can talk about it.
Okay, fair enough. So what are you going to be doing at Corbis then?
So I'm going there to manage and lead their software engineering group. I'll be the senior director of software engineering, and probably got about 8 direct reports, some development teams, system analysis team, build and configuration management team, and 1 or 2 other teams.
So what's that like? I mean, I know that in your current role you provide a lot of guidance, a lot of best practices. You work with the team system team to help them incorporate process into the product.
Right.
And now you're leaving to actually go use this hands-on. Then I guess is the
yeah. So here I'm the architect for the MSF methodology. And that's an individual contributor position, and it gives me an interesting public profile. I get to go to conferences and really lecture people on how they should be doing software development and managing software teams and so on. And I didn't get to have that position without having experience, and prior to coming here I'd been managing teams at Motorola and at Sprint PCS before that. And in the 90s I was involved in some startup companies and I ran some small development teams there. So I had this management experience, and I'd written a book called Agile Management for Software Engineering. And the team here, particularly our group product planner, Sam Guckenheimer, he had read the book and he liked the management ideas, and he thought this is really perfect for Team Foundation Server and our vision for MSF and Team System. So Microsoft called me up and offered me a job, and I came here. I thought that was an interesting opportunity to do for a couple of years. And I really explained that I felt I could only do it for about 2 years, because there's only so long that you can work in the isolated ivory tower, creating the guidance and the documentation and publishing it, before you get out of touch with reality. And I really wanted to get back to running a team doing real software engineering work, so that when I'm speaking about it and writing about it and so on, I'm doing that with some authority based on real experience. So I'm really excited the opportunity came up to go to Corbis. I live over in Seattle, so it's a nice shorter commute for me. It'll give me back a bit of time in my day, but I'm sure there's lots of challenges there that are going to keep me busy.
That's great. So do you know what kind of development processes they're using today? Have you started to figure that out yet?
Yeah, I've been involved with them for a few months. I've been doing some case study work with customers. We haven't talked about it publicly, where we're running long-term, 1 to 1.5 year case studies with Team Foundation Server, and Corbis was one of those customers. So I've known the team there for about 5 months, and it's a very traditional waterfall organization right now. They have a business analyst group that write business requirement documents, and they pass them to the system analyst group that will report to me, and they write functional specs and they pass them to the developers and so on. And it's quite slow moving, so there's going to be some challenges there to see what we can do. The company has lots of ideas about what they want to do with their website and their software applications, and those ideas greatly exceed the current capacity of the team. So the challenge is, how can we increase the capacity without adding any more people? And I would hope that we can make that team more agile, their productivity will go up, their quality will get better. But any kind of change is always difficult. So the real challenge for me is managing that change and keeping everyone on board. As a manager, I really think very deeply about my people and how I can develop them and grow them and improve them professionally and give them a career. And I hate to lose anyone. So how do I make the changes that will really enable Corbis to be wildly successful and keep everyone on board? That's the challenge for me for the next year or so. And I don't have all the answers, so it'll be a learning experience.
Sure. Well, maybe we'll check in with you after you've been there for a few months. So let's talk about that difference in development methodology. If someone's new to process, or maybe they've been doing it for a while but haven't seen the other side of the fence, how would you contrast a waterfall model with that of agile development?
So, I think that I use this term batch size. In waterfall, everything's big batches. So it's the one great big requirement document, and that's passed over to the system analysts who create the one great big functional spec document. And because you're dealing with something very large, there's a lot of complexity, and the complexity doesn't grow linearly. It's like there's a multi-dimensional explosion, exponential growth of complexity, and that leads to poorer quality typically. The chemical computer in here only holds so much at one time, and we've a tendency to overload it, and waterfall seems to do that. Seems to involve a lot of documentation because a big batch takes a long time to process, which means you need it written down because chemical computer in here can't remember everything, and the writing down takes time, so everything takes longer, and so on. And the agile thing is, let's do things in very small batches, small enough that we can hold it all in our head at one time. The complexity's less. We can remember stuff. We can hold face-to-face conversations, and we can sketch things on whiteboards. And we use a lot of tacit knowledge because the batch is small enough that we can all hold it in our heads and get it completed in 1 to 2 weeks. And the evidence that I've collected over the last few years really suggests that 1 to 2 weeks is the right kind of number. If you can make the batch of work that you're going to process, and we're going to take some requirements and design them, code them, test them, and get them ready for integration or maybe even deployment, and get all of that done in less than 2 weeks, then the quality can be very high. And the longer that time stretches, the worse and worse the quality gets. And again, it's not linear. Some data from before I joined Microsoft, the team I worked with, they got down to about 1 week batch sizes, and their quality was just great, about 3 defects for every 10,000 lines of Java they were writing. It was fabulous, almost unbelievably good. As a manager, you couldn't want a better team. And there was a neighbouring team doing similar kind of work, and they were processing the work in much larger batches and doing much less collaborative working, big batch to individual programmers. And their batch processing time was about 3 months. And the quality difference in terms of bugs found in the code was about 30 times greater. So, roughly a 10 to 15 times longer lead time is leading to about a 30 times worse bug count.
Wow, that's incredible. So is there ever a time when waterfall is a good thing? I mean, is it kind of ever applicable?
So I think the answer is maybe, but not the kind of projects I've been involved in. I hear people who've worked on things like the Mars lander or the Joint Strike Fighter or the Space Shuttle, and maybe some of these projects are sufficiently different in nature and often very big programs that last for very long numbers of years, and they're very public, government funded, taxpayers' money. There's a need for a different type of governance for that kind of a project, and it has different integration needs. You know, if you go over to our colleagues in MSN, they could be shipping an upgrade to MSN every day. And you know, some other companies we know, like Amazon here in town, they ship upgrades to Amazon.com pretty much every day. You don't do that with the Mars Lander or the Joint Strike Fighter or something of that nature. So there could be, but not in my personal experience. You know, I came from computer games. I've been in digital imaging, and then briefly in banking IT department, then in telecom, wireless telecom, and then I came here.
Great. So, I mean, it clearly sounds like most software development teams that we interact with should be thinking about Agile techniques. So why isn't everybody adopting Agile? What are the barriers to doing this?
So, I think we perceive a number of attributes of Agile development are scary to a large section of our customer base. In fact, we tried to develop MSF for Agile software development to try and address some of those fears and look at this market, what we consider middle market IT shops, where something like extreme programming is too scary. Now, the first edition of the extreme programming book said there are really only two job descriptions. There's developer and there's customer. Well, if you're in an IT department and your job title is business analyst, and your boss comes in one day and says, I've heard this extreme programming thing's really great, and if we do it we'll be more productive, and here's the book and everyone should read it, and you read that as a business analyst, then you think it's time to get your resume out and polish it up and start sending it off for job applications. So I think there's that aspect. That's scary. I also think the Agile community really hasn't addressed the scalability of Agile, and we're beginning to see some of that appearing in the literature, but there's a lack of depth to it. So how do you scale Agile in terms of an enterprise program management, portfolio management problem? There's how do you scale it for configuration management? You've got a big system or a set of projects that need to integrate into one enterprise environment. How do you set up configuration management? You really won't find much guidance on configuration management in the Agile literature, apart from the stuff on continuous integration. Well, if you're the enterprise architect for a medium to large company with a few million lines of code in your enterprise suite of applications, continuous integration isn't solving all your problems. And then there's, how do you scale in terms of architecture? You've got this suite of applications that want to run potentially on one big platform for your enterprise, and the Agile literature, with the exception of feature-driven development, really has nothing to say about architecture. In many ways it abandoned a lot of that literature and said, just design some tests and then refactor later and everything will be fine. And I think that many of our customers in senior developer positions or architect, team lead positions, they've got enough experience and they're working in an org with a big enough code base that they know that doesn't solve all their problems. So they look at Agile and they say that's only for small stuff or for pilot projects or things which are off to left field and they're not part of our mainstream platform of applications. So the Agile world has really failed to solve all those problems. And that's a big part of why I'm going to Corbis. Because in order to figure out the answers to a lot of these problems, I need to be running an org that big. And I need to have the problems to solve. I need to figure out how do we scale the configuration management, how do we scale the architecture, and how do we scale the project management. And here on the MSF team and team system, we're really very aware of those problems. And there's a limited amount about what I can say about the feature set for future versions or release dates. But for customers listening to this, we're aware of these problems and we're looking at how to deal with them in future versions of MSF and Team Foundation Server. And some of the answers are already there in the existing product. But we're also aware that we haven't solved every problem. So I'm maintaining a close relationship with the MSF team after I leave. They're going to add me to their advisory council. For those who are not aware, all of Microsoft's products, we have a customer advisory council and some hand-picked customers that are periodically brought to the Redmond campus, and we show them the design and the feature set and the schedule for future releases, and we get their input on whether it's addressing their problems and whether we're building the right product. So I'll be joining that team for the team system in the future.
So you'll still be working on MSF, just not paid by Microsoft to work on MSF?
I'll have some influence.
Great.
And I'm sure that the MSF team here will still be reading my blog. And if they want to know, does a particular technique work in terms of architecture or configuration management at enterprise scale, they'll be calling me up, or they'll be getting on the 5:45 bus from the campus here and come down to downtown Seattle and take a look for themselves.
That's great. So you mentioned some of these problems which the Team Foundation Server team is grappling with in terms of scaling Agile up to these really big projects. Do you think that's a challenge that TFS faces because this is really the first release of Team Foundation Server and the rest of Team System? Or is this just an industry-wide problem that we all have to come together and solve?
So it's an industry-wide problem. At this year's Agile conference, there was a one-day Agile leadership summit organized by the APLN, the Agile Project Leadership Network. And part of that one-day session, there was a panel, and on that panel we had 4 managers from companies like BMC Software, DTE Energy. And these 4, they were all either senior director or vice president level people. And the consistent message from all 4 was, our challenges are architecture, configuration management, and portfolio or multi-project management, rolling up the projects and everything that comes off that, the resource allocation, the governance, the budgeting, and so forth. So it's, to me, that's good evidence that it's an industry-wide problem. When we set out to do Team System version 1, it was really aimed at the individual project level as a product. And that doesn't necessarily mean small, it could mean quite large, but individual projects. So the challenge for the future of Team System is, how do we scale to the enterprise? How do we solve the portfolio management, the multi-project management solution? How do we put much more useful functionality for architects into the product? And I've seen some of the work that my friends on Team Architect are doing, and that's very exciting stuff. Personally, I'm now a customer, and I can't wait to have the next version and have my team using it. And our configuration management, the product there is really very solid already, but what we're lacking is a good set of guidance on if my project or my organization looks like the following things, and maybe there's some criteria that need to be figured out, then I should use the following style of configuration management. And one of those styles might be a single code base with continuous integration. And another style might be something like the feature crew model that we use here a lot at Microsoft, where it's more component oriented and you branch and merge back. And there's probably half a dozen other flavors like that. And some investigation needs to be done, and there's potentially a project for our patterns and practices people here in Building 5 to figure that stuff out and make that available as additional guidance. I know that my new team at Corbis, the configuration management team there, they look to Microsoft to give them advice. And I've had those questions. David, our project is like this, so should we set the source code control up this way or this other way? And I'm not sure that we have all the answers there yet. That would be a good addition to our product line.
How do we go about finding those answers? Is it just a matter of trying enough projects so we can go back and post-mortem analysis on all those projects and have the data to say that this works well in this situation? I mean, what's your reaction to that?
So I think experience is right. You know, you need to do real projects. You can't do it as a thought experiment. And there's two ways we can do that. We run real projects here in Patterns and Practices, and we develop the patterns and practices from our real work. And we go around Microsoft and we examine what are the problems the product teams are having, and can we bring that problem into the lab here at Patterns and Practices and emulate it and try and solve it, and then push that pattern or practice back out into the rest of Microsoft. But that has its own limit, and it's a big world out there with lots of customers, and I'd like to see us get much closer to customers actually using the product, and I'd really encourage customers to come forward and contact Microsoft and tell us about things you're doing well, things you like, patterns you've established that are useful, because we can get that information out to a wider audience. And equally, if you're having challenges, let us know. People ask me, well, how do I find someone at Microsoft? And you know, it's really not that difficult because we're such a wonderfully transparent company now. Go on to a popular search engine. We'd love you to use MSN Search or our new Windows Live Search that was launched today. But there are other search engines you could use. And say you wanted advice on source code control, so you could put in, team system, source code control blog, and if you search on that, you'll find someone inside the team system product unit who's blogging about source code control, and there's probably a link there that says email me. Click that and you're directly connected into our product team at the program manager or the dev lead or dev manager sort of level, and you can directly influence what we're doing with future features in the product and the way that we're implementing those features. We need that feedback from customers, and I've worked here for 2 years, and I have to say, before I joined Microsoft, I was skeptical, and I came here and I'm just so wonderfully happy. This is just such a nice, comfortable big company to work in. And I've worked in a few big companies, and this is by far the best one. And people here are very reasonable and helpful, and they do actually care about customers, and they all want to do their best to get the best product in the market. And I'd encourage customers to approach us. We're very approachable.
That's great. I was just interviewing Ed and Peter yesterday from the Patterns and Practices Lab. We were doing the tour around this building, around the new facilities. And Ed said, yeah, just look us up next time you're in Redmond, come on by and we'll give you the tour of the lab. And I'm not sure how many customers Ed's prepared to handle there, but I thought it was great just how open this place is, really.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
We aren't going to give you the designs for our next generation products, and we're probably not going to tell you the release dates, but we'll certainly show you around the facility and show you how we do software engineering. There's no secrets there.
That's fantastic. So let's get back to MSF and talk about the different process templates that are there. Out of the box we ship MSF for Agile and MSF for CMMI.
Right.
For someone who's just starting out with Team System for the first time, trying to figure out which project or which process template they want to go with, or maybe one of the other off-the-shelf customized templates that are available, or even creating their own process template,
right,
that can all be a bit overwhelming. Where do you suggest people begin?
So, something we've learned since we launched the product is that some of the guidance that we have is challenging customers, and this is certainly true at Corbis, and specifically the goal-directed design approach that's built into the methodology where we use personas and scenarios for capturing the requirements. And we put that in MSF because we genuinely use it here at Microsoft. If you walk into, say, Building 9, which is just across from here, and walk into one of the kitchens, you'll find fridge magnets on the fridges, and they're images of the personas for Windows Vista, or Longhorn as it was known earlier. And if you go around other corridors, you'll find posters up on the wall of personas for different products. And personas are imaginary people they represent market segments for the product, because in software product companies it's often very difficult to get connected with real customers. So that's in MSF, but what we've discovered is that with some IT departments, they're really saying, you know, this doesn't work for us. We don't need to do personas. If we want to meet a customer, we get in the elevator and get off 2 floors later and go talk to them. So we realize that doesn't work. And the scenario thing, which is somewhat similar to the user story approach in extreme programming, and it really comes from a body of knowledge in human-computer interaction that was started at Virginia Tech. And the full name is usage scenarios, and we kind of dropped the usage word because it doesn't get used around Microsoft. We just call them scenarios. We're finding that that's challenging for some customers, and they prefer their own way of doing requirements. So if that's true, a bunch of the work item types that we've shipped in the box don't work for those customers, and particularly in the Agile template, the scenario and particularly the scenario and to some extent the quality of service requirement work item types. So my advice is think about customizing the template and by modeling your own workflow. But we've also discovered that that's challenging and problematic for customers. So they start to model their own workflow, and I've published a little bit of guidance on that. I certainly have some slide presentation that I've presented at 1 or 2 events, and I've worked with customers doing it, 4 or 5 different customers now, and they find it actually quite hard to think about what's the workflow in our organization and who does what and how do we pass things around, but eventually they get there. The next stage is to model that workflow as a state transition diagram or a state chart so that they can then map it into the XML. And we're seeing that that's challenging. So the team here is very aware of this, and we're looking at what can we do to improve the tooling to help with that in the future. But nevertheless, although that process is challenging and time consuming for customers, it seems to be easier than trying to change behavior. For example, at Corbis we have a team that writes business requirement documents and another team that writes functional specs. They made a valiant effort to retrain those people to do personas and scenarios, and they came to the conclusion it was easier to customize the work item type definitions in the workflow. So that's what they're doing, and I think that's probably the best practice. Rather than try and re-educate a whole bunch of people in your organization, it's better to model the workflow you've got, customize the template, and then everyone feels more at home with the product. That of course has a knock-on effect. If you change the work item type definitions, you need to change the reports. And the SQL reporting, tremendously powerful as it is, it's not for everyone. Right? I think ultimately we want to get to the point where bozo managers like me can pull up SQL reporting and write a report in 5 or 10 minutes and get exactly the information they're looking for, but we're not there yet. And my advice to customers is reporting is really important to you as a manager and as an organization, and having the right reports is hugely important. So recognize that and dedicate someone to learning the reporting system so that they can write reports for you, and make sure that they get the right kind of education. And we're also aware of this at Microsoft, so we're doing our best to get information into the field through our own field, our evangelist channel, our technical solution sales channel, and other channels, to make information about how to write reports available and teach people how to write more complicated reports than the ones we shipped in the box. And of course, with every new release of MSF, we will upgrade the reports and offer more and wider variety, and there will be more depth, and customers can use those as examples to work from.
What is the release cycle for MSF? I know you said you couldn't talk about dates, but is that going to be released with the next version of Team Foundation Server or before that?
Yeah, so there's a release that's got the code name of Orcas, which is coming up relatively soon. And that will be the next public release of MSF. And what I can talk about is that we're doing a database professional version of Team System, or that's one of the SKUs in the Team Suite. And that's a really exciting new product, and I'm sure that Channel 9 has been over to talk to those guys. There will be an update to MSF to provide guidance for the database professional, and that will be in this Orcas release. Then, as soon as that happens, we will start releasing upgrades to MSF on the web via MSDN on a regular basis. I don't want to commit to monthly, but certainly no more than every 3 months.
Well, you're leaving Microsoft. You can commit the team to monthly. Who cares, right?
Yeah, I would like it to be monthly. You know, if they got on a nice like 4-week cadence, that would be good. But we'll see what happens. But regularly during 2007, and then there's a subsequent release planned, which I'm sure that I can't talk about yet. And there will be a full version of MSF there with a lot of new exciting stuff. The difference between those in the box shipments, the Orcas, and then the next one after that, is that they're fully localized. So when we ship it, we do that in English and we do it in 8 other languages. Whereas with our release to web, that will be English only. We're unlikely to localize the release to web. Maybe very occasionally. So there's actually a very exciting story on the fact that we're localized into so many languages, particularly with MSF CMMI. The Software Engineering Institute's own CMMI literature is only available in English, Simplified Chinese and Japanese, and soon to be German, where we're in 4 additional languages from that. And when I went to Taipei recently, the Taiwanese were telling me that they translated our MSF guidance into traditional Chinese. So we're actually we're available in, I believe, 9 or even 10 languages now, which is really fantastic news, and it's bringing that sort of formal software quality assurance to a much wider audience than has been possible. So we're doing that Microsoft thing of democratizing, making things available as widely as possible.
That's great. So we must have been working pretty closely with the CMMI body, or what?
We have not so much this year, but last year spent quite a bit of time with the Software Engineering Institute, really validating that our approach to CMMI was correct, because we did something very radical. We created an agile CMMI method. So our CMMI template actually includes our agile template as a subset, and there's 1 or 2 variants that the scenario and quality of service work item types went away, and we replaced it with a more generic requirement work item type. But in terms of the guidance and the narrative of the process, the methodology, it contains the agile one inside. That means it's agile at its core, it's iterative, it's adaptive, it's incremental, it's quite people focused. It uses some very simple planning techniques. It uses all the same reports, the velocity report, the work remaining report, the unplanned work report, and so on. And we think really for the first time, not only have we covered more of the CMMI model than any other tool that's ever been available, we're bringing something to market which we believe will make customers more productive. It's not just quality assurance at the cost of productivity. We've seen some people who've done CMMI level 5 implementations, and particularly if they're over in Asia, so in India perhaps, they've implemented some quite bureaucratic ways of doing it, but they get away with it because they've got a low labor cost. We actually believe that we've done something better. We've done something that's a very minimal overhead compared to our agile method, but it's more complete. It's got configuration management, architecture, requirements management, issue management, risk management, and so on. Things that need to be covered for the CMMI model, and we've managed to keep it lightweight and minimum bureaucracy, minimum waste.
So is that because Team Foundation Server on the back end is doing a lot of that heavy lifting and the day-to-day tracking and monitoring
Absolutely.
reports?
So the CMMI uses something called the Scampi appraisal method. Scampi stands for Standard CMMI Appraisal Method, something like that. And it's like an examination schema. So inside the CMMI there are 25 process areas. Each process area has a number of goals, and each of those goals has a number of practices. And if you look at the practice level, there are about 400. And you need to be providing evidence that you're doing all of those practices. And the evidence, there needs to be two types. One is called direct evidence, the other is called indirect evidence. So you can imagine that for a typical appraisal, that's a lot of paperwork. Well, Team Foundation Server gathers about 50% of all that required evidence automatically if you're following the methodology, using work item tracking, using source code control, linking work items together, using the testing, linking the tests, and so on. If you're using the whole of Team System, not just an individual SKU, but the whole thing, then it will generate about 50% of the evidence automatically.
Wow.
And that's huge. That's going to save customers time during software development, but it's also going to save time and money on appraisals. Typically with an appraisal, the first thing the appraisal does is an engagement to search for the evidence and provide their client with a report saying, here's all the evidence I couldn't find. So go away and find all this evidence, and when you've done that, come back to me and we'll do the appraisal. That initial engagement can cost tens of thousands of dollars just to find the evidence. Then they come back and they do the appraisal, and they've got all this paperwork to go through. And again, the appraisal can cost tens of thousands of dollars. We believe that we're going to cut a large amount of that cost out. We don't know yet because we haven't had a customer go through an appraisal, but we are aware of customers that are doing appraisals or planning to, either before the end of this year or very early next year. One of the case study customers I was working with in Houston, Texas, they're planning to do one close to the end of the year. And we have a number of customers in South America planning to do CMMI appraisals with MSF in the first half of next year.
Are these mostly SIs who need to get CMMI certified, or do you see other types of institutions?
No, absolutely not. In fact, the customer in Houston is a service organization. I won't mention what services they're in, but it's just an IT department. They have no need for a CMMI appraisal. They simply want to get better quality, and they want to be more reliable and to be able to offer better service to their business. And the same would be true of some of the South American companies we've talked to. In some cases, they're actually very large Brazilian corporations, and they're pursuing quality assurance and partly in alignment with their ISO 9000 initiative. So CMMI Level 3 and ISO 9000 are quite closely aligned. So the company perhaps has a company-wide ISO 9000 initiative, and therefore they want to achieve CMMI Level 3 appraisal as part of that. So they're really not doing it because they're in the outsourced business or the system integrators that need it from that marketing standpoint. Of course, we think there is a market for that, particularly for CMMI Level 5, and we've already been talking about how there's a significant part of Level 4 and 5 built into what we've already shipped, and we've made a promise that we will fill the gap and deliver a Level 5 guidance in the future. It won't be in the Orcas release, I can say that for sure, but hopefully in the following one.
Great, great. So my understanding is that even though Team Foundation Server out of the box provides CMMI Level 3, we have worked with some customers closely to help them extend and customize and move up to CMMI Level 5, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the in-the-box material has 50% coverage of Level 4. and 20% coverage of level 5. And we're certainly prepared to talk with customers about how they fill that gap. The gap is not huge. We've set the methodology up the right way so that filling the gap, really level 5 is about something called continuous improvement. It's the ability to use lots of objective data you've gathered with Team Foundation Server and our reporting system, and get your organization together and look at the data and say, how can we improve? What changes can we make? And then to manage those changes in a way that you're actually recording, we made a specific decision to make a change, we made that change, and we recorded the data, and now we've got new reports and we can compare the two together. Very similar to other quality assurance techniques. Six Sigma would be one, for example. When they want to do a process improvement, they call it a Six Sigma Black Belt project, and they manage the implementation of the change and they record whether it's an improvement or not. In Japanese manufacturing, they call it Kaizen, and somewhere like Toyota, when they make an improvement, they call that a Kaizen event. Kaizen literally means continuous improvement in Japanese. In America, the Kaizen techniques get called lean manufacturing. So we're finding that our CMMI method is proving very popular with IT organizations in companies that already do Six Sigma or Kaizen or lean. Automotive companies, for example, also financial companies, companies that do a lot of financial transactions, credit card processing, for example. The Six Sigma methodology is very popular there because if they have a defect in a transaction, that's real money that gets lost. Right? So they don't want to lose real money. So having a very, very high quality in the transaction processing is important. So we often find those businesses have implemented Six Sigma everywhere except their IT department. And the same in automotive plants where the entire factory is running using some quality assurance method except the IT department. So at the very senior ranks of the company, the executive committee, there's typically someone on that group there with a title like CIO, Chief Information Officer, or Executive Vice President of IT. And he or she is the only person on the executive committee who's not playing on the team. They're not doing the quality assurance thing that everyone else is doing. So when we explain what our MSF CMMI method is and what you can do with it and how it maps into Lean or Six Sigma, their eyes light up and it resonates with them because they think, hey, I can go back to my colleagues and I can show them that I'm playing on the team. And I believe that's very unique. I haven't seen any of our competitors deliver a methodology that helps like that.
That's great. I can see how it really can dovetail then with the concepts with Agile, where every iteration you can look back and say, what went well, what went wrong, what can we change, and just constantly improve.
Right.
And can we talk about some of the reports that are in Team Foundation Server?
Sure. I have some on my screen. First of all, I want to give a plug to Sam Guggenheimer's book. This is Software Engineering with Visual Studio Team System by Sam Guggenheimer, who's our group product planner. So I want to bring this a bit closer here.
There you go.
Published by Addison Wesley. And people look at this and they say, oh, another team system book. Well, actually, this is one of the best books on software engineering that's possibly ever been written. And it really explains the philosophy of why team system, why Team Foundation Server, why MSF, why the reports that are in it, how do you use them to be more effective. And I'd really encourage you to read it. Perhaps you've already got a book on team system. And I'm looking here, for example, this one. A bunch of my colleagues were involved in writing this one. Eric Gunvoldson here, a good friend of mine, and Noah Code. And this one really tells you about the features and functionality in the product and how to use the product at a very basic level. And it's an incredibly thick book because it's an incredibly big product. Well, if you want to understand the philosophy and how to really turn on the return on investment from Team System, a nice thin book by Sam Guggenheimer. That's the answer.
I agree. That was a great book. I just finished reading it and really could not put it down. I mean, I can't say enough about how valuable his book was.
So, another great thing about working at Microsoft, I got to go on this 3-week Asian tour very recently to talk to our customers in Asia. And I spent a Sunday in Vietnam, and I got to go out to Ha Long Bai, which is a World Heritage Site, and I took this photograph. I'm going to miss some of those opportunities. This is actually me speaking here in Taipei to an audience of about 450 people. But I want to briefly talk about one or two of these slides. You know, this one summarizes what I think the real problem that we're trying to solve with Team System is. So, not my most recent trip to Tokyo, but the previous one was in April 2005. And I got stuck on the Shoto Expressway in downtown Tokyo in the Shinjuku neighborhood where Microsoft's office happens to be. And it's an elevated freeway and it's stuck in traffic, and I looked out the window of the car and I could see the 8th story of a neighbouring building. It was 8 p.m. at night, and inside I saw a scene like this, an entire floor of what looked like software engineers still working away. The entire department was there.
At 8 o'clock at night? At
8 o'clock at night.
Wow.
And, you know, my conclusion is that that individually we have all these people, and we're well educated, we're very smart, high IQs, knowledge workers. But put us together collectively and ask us to get something done, and we end up working very hard rather than smart. And I like to refer to my colleague in the industry here. I'm sorry this doesn't show up, but this is Barry Boehm, who's the professor of software engineering at the University of Southern California. And this is a quote from his book Software Engineering Economics, where he concluded that poor management can increase software costs more rapidly than any other factor. And management is really about organizing people to get stuff done. So a lack of ability to organize these people to get stuff done leads to them working harder rather than smarter. So that leads us to this thing where with project management in our profession, if you want to avoid being late, you have to go out and hire a bunch of heroes and then expect them to work heroically and really slave hard, long hours to get stuff done because we haven't figured out how to do it smart. So that's the lead in, and I think Team System is the beginning of solving this problem. Team System and MSF and what we're doing with reporting. So I'm going to skip through some of the rest of the slide deck, which is very amusing, but we don't have time. And
can you make this available up on your blog?
Absolutely, I'll put this up on my blog. This is a derivative of slides that I presented at the Agile conference this year, and actually a slide deck that I used on my Asian tour recently, so I'll put this on the blog and make it available. Some of the slides people will have seen before, but I developed some new material to talk about iteration planning in Team System. So if I show this one, we talk about agile iterations, and in an ideal world, agile teams focus on testing and they produce really high quality and there's never any bugs. But the real reality is that you build code for a while and then you start testing and fixing it, and in MSF we call that stabilization. Then on the front end of an iteration, there's always some planning, some setup of the environment, some analysis work gets done. And on the back end, there's usually some kind of deployment or handoff to a different department. There's a tear down of the environment, there's a retrospective, and so on. Well, we can look at these elements and we can say that the value add is here when we're building the software, and our planning, setup and analysis, and deployment, tear down and retrospective, those are essentially an overhead, but they're a necessary overhead. They count as necessary waste from a lean or Kaizen perspective. But our stabilization, our testing and fixing, period is essentially unnecessary waste. If we had no bugs, we wouldn't need to stabilize. So what we really want to do as managers is shrink this down to as small as possible, hopefully eradicate it completely, and then look at how we might be able to shrink these overheads, and then in the same period of time we should be able to build more code. So we provide some reports to help with this in terms of managing on a daily basis. So the work remaining report helps us track the code we're building, and our bug report here helps us track the decrease in active bugs and incoming bugs and so on.
So these are reports in Team Foundation server today?
That's right. These are in the box today. And then we provide the issues and blocked work items report, which is really used throughout the life cycle to track things which are slowing us down. For example, if you have an ambiguous requirement, that should be logged as an issue, and the number of open issues is shown on this graph. And it should be linked to the work items for the features or scenarios or other functionality which are blocked as a result of that ambiguous requirement. They would show up as a spike on this blue line, which is probably hard to see on the video. So issues and blocked work items is a really good health report for managers. It shows how healthy is the project and how much risk is the schedule under. Lots of blue spikes and sustained height on the blue spike is telling us that our schedule's at high risk. Equally, the issue chart in the back is telling us how many issues are occurring and how quickly are we resolving them. This is the unplanned work report. So I guess I'm famous for introducing this term dark matter. So there are really three types of unplanned work. There's change request, which is something formal from the customer. They came and said, hey, we forgot something, can you add it in for us please? That would be a new scenario, for example. Then there's dark matter, the second category, which says, gee, this scenario that we wrote at the beginning of the project is really vague and ambiguous. Let's rewrite it as 5 new scenarios which are much more fine-grained and specific. So one scenario on the original plan becomes 5. Those extra 4 are dark matter, the things that were always there, the stuff of the universe that was always there. From the customer perspective, it was something that was always in scope, but on your first pass analysis you didn't capture it well enough. My experience working with teams in the last 7 or 8 years is that a really good team experiences about 15% dark matter, and a relatively inexperienced team can be 100% or more. So if you think about that, if you think you can do 100 scenarios in a project plan, maybe you can only do 50 because you've got 100% dark matter potential. So it's important to know. The third class of unplanned work is bugs or defects, to use the formal software engineering terminology, and there's lots of literature on this. A really good team will experience less than 1% unplanned work growth through defects. A really lousy team will experience about 600% growth. So in other words, a chart like this would go like right off my screen and potentially out through the ceiling into the next floor of the building. So it's important to know this information when you're planning, because you need to buffer for it. So if I build this whole slide here, we're trying to discourage the idea that you do a build phase and then a stabilize phase and get people to start testing as soon as they start building. So I've overlapped these things. But if you think you can build for, if this is 10 weeks here and you thought you could build for say 7 of these weeks, you actually need to buffer for dark matter. So the portion of this which is above the dotted line, you need to buffer for it. You can't build any code during that time. And then you should look at the issues and blocked work items and look at historic data and say, what was the impact of blocked work items and how much should we be buffering for that? So create a buffer in here in the plan for dark matter expansion, and create a buffer here for issues and blocked work items. No need to buffer for bugs, because the mean velocity number on our velocity report already absorbs that. No buffer for change requests, because you can always renegotiate with the customer if they ask for something. So if you're planning an iteration, you've allowed a certain amount, you can use the velocity data from previous iterations and divide it into the time you've set aside, and that will produce a number of scenarios. You then have to sub out scenarios for an allowance for dark matter. And equally, if you want to understand how much waste are we experiencing, what's the volume of this stabilization? Well, that's the stabilization waste is our bug velocity times the anticipated number of bugs, and that will tell you, say that this is, if this was 10 weeks in total and this was 7 weeks here, how many of those 7 weeks are we spending fixing bugs? For a poor and immature team, it could be as many as 5 out of 7 weeks. And for a really good team, it might only be 1 or 2 days out of 7 weeks. And we skip this. So, this is a problem to explain it. If we had an iteration, we were going to plan an iteration, and we had data that said our historical velocity was 1.7 scenarios on average, we would get that from the velocity report. And the low end variation was 0.8 and the high end was 2.5. Again, we would get that from the velocity report. We had a dark matter growth of 30%. Our bug fix velocity was 20 per developer per week. Our bug insertion rate was 10 per scenario. Historically, blocked issues happened 4 times per iteration and cost us 1 week of delay. Deployment teardown retrospective, we know historically is taking us 3 days. We have 10 developers and we have 10 weeks available. We can use all that information to make a plan, and we can gather this pretty quickly. All we really need to know is what's the list of scenarios we might want to do in the next iteration. So this slide has the answer. Our setup, planning, risk mitigation. My advice is time box that to between 5 and 15%. As risk mitigation, don't let it exceed 15%. So let's pick 10% and say it's 1 week. Deployment, teardown and retrospective is 3 days. We know that already. And if we have a 10-week period, well, we've already used 1 week and 3 days. That leaves us, somehow the arithmetic looks wrong here. Oh, let's take 1 week for blocked issues. So from this previous slide, where we said that there was 1 week of delay from blocked issues previously, so let's allow for that. Well, that will leave us with 7 weeks and 2 days to do real work. We can multiply that by the average velocity. That gives us 122 scenarios that we should be able to complete. But we know that dark matter was 30%, so really we should only commit to 85 scenarios. Our stretch goal could be based on the numbers times the higher velocity, which would be 180. So in other words, we should take 85 must-have requirements because we know we'll get those done. Our historical data tells us that. And we can take 95 preferred or nice-to-have scenarios, and we should have those in a strict order so that once we get past the 85 point, we can build them in the most valuable order to the customer. And our stabilization waste, based on the data we had in the previous slide, would be 12 developer weeks, which works out at 1.2 calendar weeks. And that's just based on taking the number of scenarios, multiplying out the defect insertion rate, dividing that by the bug fix velocity, and coming up with, out of our 10-week period, we're spending 1 week and 2 days on fixing defects, on waste that we would like to eliminate. And if we could introduce, using techniques like static code analysis, dynamic code analysis, unit testing, and so forth, features in Team System, hopefully we could reduce this number and we would see that improvement over time, and that's real process improvement and continuous improvement, and it's how you get more competitive and deliver more value in the same period of time.
That's great.
Yeah, that's what we've been teaching, and I'll get the slide deck out on the web on agilemanagement.net, and I'll link it from from our MSDN page, and I'm sure you can link it from Channel 9.
You bet, you bet. So this has really been fantastic. Thank you, David, for taking the time during your last week. I know it's busy. It's hard to imagine how you can really put together these equations and drive your team without the data that's in Team Foundation Server. So thanks for taking us, sort of under the hood and showing us these numbers that can be used to
Sure.
drive a software team.
It was a big takeaway in Asia that people we showed this to said, wow, we never believed that we could get data like this, and they'd never want to manage any other way ever again. Once they've seen it, they realize the power, and we're really switching on a light for the management community and software engineering.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again. Good luck at Corbis, and I'm sure we'll hear lots of great stuff from you in the future.
Thank you.